Now we're getting into the small arms survey, folks, from 2007, where they tried to do a count of the number of firearms there are in the world in civilian possession, military and police possession. And I'm not going to read all this off to you, but there's a lot of pertinent data prior to getting into these numbers where they show that gun cultures don't automatically translate into armed conflict. You've got the attrition enigma, where it's guesstimates about how many firearms are, wear out, because, they wear out like anything else, and how many are lost from the count due to that. There's a lot of information, like the counts of Yemen is one country where the estimates of number of guns there are absolutely outrageously, some of them are completely outrageous. And they try to separate the wheat from the chaff, as it were, as far as some of these estimates, and they try to get rid of the outliers and come up with reliable estimates. But there are several. Nobody rivals the U.S., but there are several countries that do have what one could say is a gun culture, and some of them are in Europe. So OtherDude's stupid comments, he doesn't really know how many guns there are in these European countries. He makes it sound as if, there's just a lot of it has to do with culture. Germany, another screenshot I'll have up, and I'll just let all those screenshots roll by. But there's a lot of unregistered weapons in France, Germany, Mexico, Russia, and Brazil. And France and Germany don't have a problem with homicide, but Brazil, Russia, and Mexico do. So I'll let those screenshots go by. Make sure you read everything carefully, and then I'll read off when we get to the actual numbers of what they came up with. Switzerland's also another country that they concentrate on quite a bit as far as trying to come up with a count of how many weapons there are there. Now, if you paid attention to the screenshots going by, folks, you've now got a gist of how they compile these estimates, the problems with unregistered weapons, attrition, and whatnot, and how there's a lot of people who really don't know what they're talking about. They get a lot of this crap off of blogs like OtherDupe. But all the countries with reliable estimates, and I'm throwing Yemen out, but when you look at the largest civilian firearms arsenals, the U.S. is head and shoulders above everybody. But Switzerland and Finland, they hold their own at over 45 firearms per 100 people. That's almost a gun for every other person. Sweden and Norway pretty close. And if you paid attention, Brazil, one of those countries that took away all their citizens' guns, melted a bunch of them down, confiscated them. Brazil has a low ownership of firearms per 100 people. So keep in mind, OtherDupe says more guns equals more violent crime. You've got to restrict gun ownership. So the U.S., Switzerland, Finland, Sweden, and Norway have a lot of guns. Not nearly as much as the U.S., but they have a lot. France, Canada, and Austria are actually fairly high. Germany, the reason it's a lot higher than most people would think is they have a lot of unregistered weapons there. Panama, it's another country we'll go over. They have a lot less guns than the U.S. per 100. A lot less guns than most people. Mexico's done a fine job of disarming their citizens. The only people who have guns in Mexico are the police, military, and the cartels. Regular Joe Six-Pack, he can't get a gun there. South Africa, it's very hard for a private citizen to own a gun there unless you're a bigwig. Estonia and Russia, not many guns to go around there among private citizens. There's Brazil at 8.0 guns per 100 people. The Bahamas, not many guns there either. So keep all those in mind. Look at those figures, study them, and remember them, because we're going to go over some crime data now that will help further undermine OtherDupe's contention that more guns equals more violent crime. He'll say more gun homicide. That's not necessarily true. But when you figure in defensive gun uses, which I'll go over at the end of this video, so bear with me, folks. You'll probably learn something. OtherDupe, he wants it done in 2 minutes. You got to have 2-minute answers. It's like minute rice. So he's a moron. So get ready for that data, which will undermine his more guns equals more crime contention. Okay, I'm utilizing UN data here. Intentional homicide count and rate per 100,000, 1995 to 2011. If you want to go in there, I've got all the links underneath there. Look at all the data for yourself, all the years if you want. Not every country has data for every single year here, but you can see Switzerland, which has a lot less guns than the U.S., but a lot more guns than most countries. They don't have a homicide problem. Intentional homicide per 100,000 is 0.7 for those 3 years I put up, and a lot of them they didn't have data for 2011, so I just went with the last three. Norway, 0.7, 0.6, 0.6, low rate. Sweden, another country that has a lot more guns than Bahamas, Brazil, Estonia, Russia, more guns than most countries. Their rate is 0.9 or 1 per 100,000. Sweden and Norway and Switzerland all have a lot more guns than the UK per 100 people, yet their homicide rate is lower. Go figure. The Russian Federation, private citizens can't own guns very easily there. Their homicide rate's more than twice the U.S. Estonia's is a lot higher than the U.S. Finland, which has more guns than most countries, their rate is lower than ours. They have a lot less guns, a lot fewer guns per 100 people than we do, but they've got a lot more guns than the Russian Federation and Estonia, yet their homicide rate is not stratospheric. You've got Austria, which has would be considered a country with a lot of guns, a lot of firearms per 100 people, more than most. They have a low homicide rate. You remember France and Germany. France and Germany, if you remember that screenshot from earlier concerning unregistered weapons, France and Germany both have a high volume of weapons that are firearms that are not registered. There are a lot more guns there than people would like you to think, yet their homicide rates are not stratospheric. As an aside, I'll go over some homicide data from the UK. Their homicide rate was slightly lower before they engaged in this crazy gun control. Panama, their homicide rate is outrageous, and they have a lot less guns per 100 than the United States. The average citizen down in Panama, compared to the average Joe Six-Pack in America, it's very hard for them to get a gun down there. Here in the U.S., in most states, it's not that hard. Yet our homicide rate is nowhere near Panama's. And you got Canada, which has a low homicide rate. Then you've got the U.S. is there, which has declined even further from that data. And as I went over earlier, if you look at ethnic groups, we've got a portion of the population that's less than 1/5, but they're responsible for half the homicides. Then you got Mexico, which is in deep, deep trouble. 17.7, 22.7, 23.7. It's really bad. I feel sorry for any average person living in Mexico. Brazil, they've taken measures to get guns out of basically everybody's hands, but the bad guys still get them, ironically. It's amazing. Their homicide rate is well over 20 per 100,000. The Bahamas, they also have a high homicide rate, yet the average Joe Schmo down there isn't going to get guns. South Africa, insanely high homicide rate. Look at how could other dupe say this? He acts like the U.S. is South Africa. If you want to see crime running wild, go to South Africa, go to Estonia, go to Russia, go to Mexico, go to Brazil. That's where you'll find it. Then you've got percentage of homicides by firearm, number of homicides by firearm, and homicide by firearm rate per 100,000 population. This also, of course, doesn't factor in defensive gun uses, but Panama, percentage of homicides by firearm, look at that. 65%, 79%, 81%. Nowhere near the U.S.'s rate. They have a lot less guns than we do. Canada's, it's about a third. Then you got the U.S., about 2/3. Panama's is rising. And so look at Brazil, 70.8%. Again, there's a lot of gaps in these data. In this data, I apologize for that. I just tried to get as many countries in the same screenshot as possible and get as many years, but feel free to go look at it yourself if you'd like. I've got all the data there. Mexico, ironically, Mexico, in those 2 years, their percentage of homicides by firearm is lower than the U.S.'s, but they have an amazingly high homicide rate. Look at that. Percentage of homicide rate by firearm rate per 100,000 population. You got that as well. So in Mexico, they'll shank you too. They'll choke you. Norway, they don't have a high homicide rate, nor are there many of their homicides by firearm. This Sweden, I didn't basically no data for them. Then you got the UK. Not many of their homicides are by firearm. But as I'll go over later, in the UK, if you want to kill somebody, what they've gone to now, since the homicide rate has gone up in the last 12 years there slightly from before they engaged in this outrageous gun control, they'll push you down a flight of stairs, they'll stomp your face in, they'll shank you, they'll run you over with a car. Estonia, not much data there. Percentage of homicides by firearm, 3.9%. So, Finland, 18.8%, 22.7%, and 19.8%, roughly a fifth. Then you've got the Bahamas. Ironically, the Bahamas has a lower percentage of homicides by firearm in that 1 year than the U.S. typically does. But they've got a higher homicide rate, so they'll shank you. They'll use something other than a gun. Switzerland, in that 1 year, there's not much data. They had a high percentage that are homicides by firearm, but they have a low homicide rate overall. So most of the homicides there, they'll shoot you, but there's not a whole lot of homicides overall. So would you consider that bad, other dupe? If they were averaging over 70% of their homicides by firearm, but the rate itself was a lot lower than ours? Just asking, dummy. Then you got Austria, 24.1% and 29.5%. France, not much data there, but they have a low homicide rate. In Germany, a little over 1/4 of their homicides are committed with a firearm. Let's go over UK. This would be England and Wales, if I remember. Yes. many people champion their gun controls as a way to reduce homicide, and all you got to do is copy England and Wales, and by golly, you'll have a veritable utopia. The problem is, even before the UK engaged in this insane gun control, their homicide rate was rather low. For example, and this is from their own data, the Home Office, their own data. Again, I have the links to all that. You can go look at that. From 1980 to 1997, the homicide rate per 100,000 in the UK. Now, they've got it listed there. They do it per million population, but I'm taking it down to 100,000. 1980 to 1997, homicide rate per 100,000 in England and Wales was 1.123. From 2000 to 2011, 1.376. So you can see how the homicide rate actually went up a little bit after their insane gun control. And I'll have the demographics for all these countries coming up right after this. In the UK, as in previous years, the most common method of killing for both male and female victims was by a knife or other sharp instruments. So you take away the guns and they'll shank you. They'll shank you. The most common method of killing was a knife or some other sharp instrument. In previous years, the second most common method of killing was hitting or kicking. So they'll punch you, they'll throw you down a flight of stairs, they'll asphyxiate you, choke you. The barbarians will do whatever they need to do, whether they have guns available or not. They still had the Cumbria shootings, even with that gun control. You mean that didn't stop them? Over a third of both male and female homicides in the last 3 years involved a sharp instrument. Over a quarter of male homicides over the last 3 years involved hitting or kicking. Almost a fifth of female homicides over the last 3 years in England and Wales resulted from strangulation. Then you got Harold Shipman. You know, if we take him, remove him, that brings the homicide rate down. Well, of course, Harold Shipman did not use a gun. He used lethal overdoses of heroin to kill his victims. And I've got stats there. Figure 1.2% of offenses currently recorded as homicide by apparent method of killing and sex of victim combined years 2008. 09 to 2010, 2011. You can see how a sharp instrument or hitting and kicking is a very common way to dispose of people you don't like. At least that's how they do it in the UK. Their homicide rate went up slightly after their gun control, so they didn't really have a problem with it before. They had a mass killing and they went bonkers and said, well, we'll just ruin it for everybody. But their homicide rate slightly went up, so I don't see how that really helped. All you did was change the method. Instead of shooting people, they're throwing them down a flight of stairs. They're stoving their face in with a ball bat. So, good job. And that's it for this part, folks. I'll finish this up in part 3 just so these don't get too awful long, but takes a while to go over this info. This is not something Other Dupe or Old Fart Rants can do because they're not very smart and they need 3-minute answers. They need it in 3 minutes. So we'll finish this up in part 3.